I spent a year in the shadows, saving the only surviving heirs of his bloodline, the very children he thought were lost to a massacre. But the moment I reached for his hand at our ceremony, my Alpha didn't give me a ring. He gave me silver chains and a traitor's brand. Now we are trapped together in a frozen mountain where the only thing colder than the ice is the look in his eyes. And the only thing more dangerous than the men hunting us is the truth he isn't ready to hear. Hi! Welcome to Vine Romance, where love speaks and hearts connect. If you believe in beautiful love stories, hit subscribe, like, and comment. And kindly join our growing family. Let's grow in love together. Chapter 1. The silver chains didn't just bite into my skin. They shredded the very soul of the woman who had spent a lifetime protecting the man now holding the leash. Seraphina stood on the jagged overhang of the iron-claw border, her obsidian black cloak snapping behind her like a raven's wing. To anyone else, the forest below was a tangle of shadows, but to her, it was a grid. 3 guard rotations to the east. 2 scouts are currently watering their wolves at the stream, and 1 gap in the perimeter near the Dead Man's Pass. She pulled her hood lower because the wind was starting to howl. Her fingers traced the small, carved wooden wolf in her pocket. It was a token from the rival pack's territory. "They are just children," the voice of the rival healer echoed in her mind. "Nah, they have no part in this war." Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was a stark contrast to the calm, analytical mask she wore for the pack. If she did this, she was violating the High Alpha's direct decree. She was risking the very life she had built. But as she watched a tiny, flickering light appear at the edge of the forbidden pass, she knew she had to move. After that, she checked the position of the moon. She was the shadow of this pack. She saw what they refused to see. If Jax wanted a strategist, he must accept that she would play the board to save the pieces he'd forgotten. "Seraphina." The voice was a low rumble. It vibrated through the stone beneath her boots. She didn't jump because she couldn't afford to. She slowly turned to see Alpha Jax standing 10 paces back. He wasn't shifted, but his presence was heavy. His golden eyes seemed to burn with a strange intensity. Next, he stepped into the moonlight. "The ceremony begins in 3 hours, Jax said. His gaze searched hers. "Why are you out here counting shadows when you should be preparing to take your place by my side?" "A good strategist never stops counting, Jax," she replied. Her voice was smooth. She stepped toward him. The distance between them crackled with the mate bond. It was a heat that promised safety. From there, Jax reached out. He tucked a stray silver hair behind her ear. His touch was warm. "Tonight, you stop being just my strategist," Jax murmured. "Tonight, you become my mate, my law, my heart." Seraphina forced a smile. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was about to lie to the only man she had ever loved. Would you risk your soul to save an innocent enemy? The great hall was a cage of cedar and stone. Maps were spread across the heavy oak table. Seraphina pointed to the southern ridge. "If we move the scouts here, we leave the northern pass open for wildlife migration," she said. Her voice didn't waver. Still, her pulse was a drum in her ears. Jax leaned over the table. His shoulder brushed hers. The scent of rain and musk rolled off him. It made her wolf stir with a desperate need to confess. Not only that, but his hand came down on the map. It landed right over the dead man's pass. "Why the northern pass, Serafina?" Jax asked. His voice was low. "It's tactically weak." "Because the terrain is too rough for an army," she countered. She looked him in the eye. "No one would be foolish enough to send a strike team through the frozen rocks." In fact, she was counting on that foolishness. She needed that gap for the children. Jax watched her for a long moment. What followed was a silence so thick it felt like physical weight. "I trust your mind, Sarah," he finally said. "But your heart feels distant tonight." He moved closer. The air thickened. He trapped her between the table and his massive frame. "Is there something you aren't telling your Alpha?" Maybe it was fate, but a guard burst in before she could answer. "Alpha, the council is calling for the final blessing." Jax sighed. He pressed his forehead against hers. "Go," he whispered. "Get dressed. I want you in white and silver." Soon after, Serafina fled the room. She didn't go to her chambers. Instead, she ran toward the servants' entrance. Her body moved on instinct. She had 90 minutes. She had to lead those children to the hidden cave before the sun dipped. If she failed, they would die. If she succeeded, she might lose Jax forever. She didn't know what scared her more. The snow was beginning to fall in thick, heavy flakes. Serafina shifted. Her wolf was a sleek, silver blur against the white landscape. She reached the pass in record time. 3 small figures huddled under a rock ledge. They were shivering. They were small, no older than 7. Their scents were wrong. They smelled of the rival pack, but their eyes were full of human terror. Without thinking, she nudged the smallest one with her nose. "The Silver Lady?" the boy whispered. He reached out and touched her fur. She chuffed softly. She began to lead them toward the frozen vein cave system. It was a labyrinth only she knew. Every step felt like a heavy sin. What's worse, she could hear the drums of the ceremony starting in the distance. The sound echoed through the valley. It felt like a countdown to her own execution. Still, she pushed the children forward. Moments later, they reached the mouth of the cave. She shifted back into her human form. She was naked and shivering in the cold. She grabbed the spare clothes she had hidden there. "Stay here," she told them. "Do not make a sound until the moon is at its peak. Then follow the markers I left." "Why are you helping us?" the oldest girl asked. "Because a wolf who kills pups has no soul," Serafina said. She felt a pang of guilt. Jax wouldn't see it that way. To him, these children were future soldiers of the enemy. Eventually, she turned and ran back toward the village. By the time she reached her room, her feet were bleeding. She scrubbed the scent of the rival pack off her skin. She put on the white silk dress. She put on the silver jewelry. Beneath the moonlight, she looked like a perfect bride. But inside, her wolf was howling in grief. The hall of judgment was packed with hundreds of wolves. The air smelled of incense and anticipation. Serafina walked down the center aisle. Every eye was on her. She saw the council of elders sitting in the front row. Elder Varric was watching her with a sharp, suspicious gaze. Yet, her eyes were only for Jax. He stood at the altar. He looked like a god of war. He wore a ceremonial leather harness that showed off his powerful chest. As the silence stretched, she reached him. He took her hands. His grip was firm. "You're late," he whispered. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it doubt? "The mountains were restless," she lied. The high priest stepped forward. "Do you, Jax of the Iron Claw, claim this woman as your law and your mate?" "I do," Jax roared. The sound vibrated in Seraphina's chest. "And do you, Seraphina, swear total loyalty to your Alpha and your pack?" Before the words left her lips, the heavy doors of the hall swung open. A scout ran in. He was holding the wooden wolf token. He looked terrified. To make things worse, Elder Varric stood up. "Stop the ceremony," he screamed. "There has been a breach at the Dead Man's Pass. A traitor has aided the enemy." At that moment, the world tilted. Jax's grip on her hands tightened until it hurt. The tension broke like a physical snap. "Sarah?" he asked. His voice was a warning. She couldn't breathe. Her thoughts spun. She looked at the token in the scout's hand. She looked at the fury growing on Jax's face. Truth be told, she knew it was over. Without warning, Jax let go of her hands. But then, he didn't reach for her waist. He reached for the heavy silver chains sitting on the altar. "Search for her!" Varric commanded. Jax didn't wait. He grabbed her wrists. The moment their eyes locked, she saw the love vanish. It was replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He snapped the shackles shut. The silver burned her skin instantly. "Traitor!" Jax whispered. The word echoed in the silent hall as the heavy chains dragged her to her knees. This was the man she loved. And now, he was her executioner. The ceremony was over. The hunt had begun. The heavy chains dragged Seraphina to the stone floor with a bone-jarring thud. Every eye in the Hall of Judgment was a needle of ice piercing her skin. Jax stood over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. His scent, usually a sanctuary of pine and rain, now smelled of ozone and betrayal. She looked up at him, hoping to find a flicker of the man who had kissed her forehead hours ago, but his golden eyes were twin suns of cold fury. Without warning, Elder Varric stepped forward. He held the wooden wolf token like it was a rotting corpse. "The scent of the rival pack is all over this," Varric sneered, "and it's all over her." Seraphina's breath caught in her throat because the silver was already eating into her wrists. It felt like liquid fire. Deep down, she knew the truth was her only shield. Yet she couldn't speak it without sentencing those children to death. Next, Jax reached down. He grabbed the front of her white silk dress and hauled her up to eye level. His strength was terrifying. "Tell me it's a lie, Sarah," he growled. The sound was a physical blow. "Tell me you didn't go to the pass." She swallowed hard. Her voice was a ragged whisper. "I went to the pass, Jax." What followed was a gasp that rippled through the hundreds of wolves in the hall. The tension in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Jax's grip tightened. His knuckles were white. For a second, she thought he might crush her throat right there. Rather, he shoved her back toward the stone altar. "Search her chambers," Jax commanded. His voice was devoid of emotion. "Search every inch of her life. If she's a spy, I want to know who she's feeding." As the silence roared, Seraphina felt the first tear track through the ceremonial ash on her cheeks. She was the pack's greatest mind, and she had failed to calculate the cost of mercy. What's worse, Varric was smiling. He leaned in close to Jax's ear. "Why wait for a search, Alpha? The law for treason is clear. Execution by the first moonrise. Maybe it was fate, but a low rumble of thunder shook the hall. The great blizzard was no longer a threat. It had arrived. Would you stand your ground when the person you loved most became your judge and jury? The iron doors of the shadow cell slammed shut with a finality that made Seraphina's wolf howl in agony. She was alone in the dark, her wrists raw and bleeding from the silver. Still, she didn't stop moving. She paced the 3-foot span of the cage because the cold was starting to numb her toes. She had to stay awake. She had to think. What's worse, her mind kept looping back to the look on Jax's face. It wasn't just anger. It was the look of a man whose world had been set on fire. You always were too smart for your own good, Sarah. The voice came from the shadows outside the bars. It was Jax. He was alone. In fact, he looked like he hadn't slept in days, though it had only been an hour. He stepped into the torchlight, and Seraphina saw the blood on his hands. He had been punching the stone walls. Not only that, but his breathing was heavy, like he was fighting his wolf for control. "Why them?" Jax asked. His voice was a jagged edge. "Of all the packs to betray us for, why the ones who murdered my family?" "It isn't what you think, Jax," she said. Her voice trembled. She moved toward the bars, the chains clinking against the floor. "I wasn't feeding them secrets. I was stopping a slaughter." Truth be told, she wanted to reach through the iron and touch his face, but she knew he would recoil. The space between them burned with the ghost of 1,000 touches. Jax laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was a dry, hollow sound. "Slaughter? They are vipers, Seraphina, and you brought them to our door." He leaned against the bars, his forehead pressed against the cold metal. "The council wants your head on a spike by morning. They are voting now." Moments later, the mountain groaned. A massive shelf of snow shifted above them. The cell block shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Jax looked up, his instincts surging. "The storm. It's sealing the lower passes," he muttered. As the wind shifted, the scent of the rival pack's trackers caught his nose. They were searching for the children. The floor of the cell tilted as a secondary tremor hit. Seraphina fell to her knees, the silver chains jarring her shoulders. "Jax, listen to me," she screamed over the rising roar of the wind. "If you kill me, you kill the only chance of stopping what's coming." Before she could move, the ceiling of the guard room outside the cell collapsed. A massive block of granite fell between Jax and the exit. The air thickened with dust and the smell of sulfur. Jax didn't hesitate. His body moved on instinct. He shifted midair, his clothes shredding as a massive obsidian wolf took his place. He lunged at the bars of her cell. His claws tore through the iron like it was parchment. With a single glance, he grabbed the center of her chains in his teeth. He yanked her out of the crumbling cell just as the back wall gave way to the crushing weight of the snow. Soon after, they were tumbling into the dark, falling into the secondary tunnels of the mountain. They landed in a heap of snow and shattered stone. Seraphina coughed, her lungs burning. She looked up to see Jax, now back in his human form but covered in soot and blood. He was staring at her with a predatory intensity. "The exit is blocked," Jax said. His voice was a low growl. "We are trapped in the frozen vein." Which meant they were stuck together in the most dangerous labyrinth on the continent. Even so, He didn't unchain her. He wrapped the excess silver links around his hand. "You're still my prisoner, traitor," he whispered. He hauled her to her feet. "But I won't let the mountain have the pleasure of killing you. That right belongs to me." Beneath the moonlight filtering through a crack in the ceiling, she saw the shift in his soul. He was no longer her mate. He was a hunter who had caught his prize. In the quiet that followed, the only sound was the clink of the silver. Without another word, he pushed her into the darkness of the tunnels. She felt it, etched in fire. The bond was still there, pulsing with a hate that felt far too much like love. The silence of the cave was more terrifying than the storm. Seraphina's breath came in white puffs of mist. Every step was a battle because the silver was draining her strength. Jax walked ahead of her, his pace relentless. He didn't care that her bare feet were turning blue against the ice. Rather, he seemed to be using the pain to fuel his own resolve. "Why are we going deeper, Jax?" she asked. Her thoughts spun. "The surface is that way." "The surface is a death trap," Jax snapped. He didn't turn around. "The blizzard has turned the peaks into a slaughterhouse. This is the only way to the thermal vents." Not only that, but he knew the rival trackers would be waiting at the main gates. In the span of a breath, Seraphina realized his logic was still flawless, even in his rage. He was protecting her, even if it was just so he could be the one to punish her. She didn't know whether to thank him or scream. Without warning, Jack stopped. The tunnel ahead narrowed into a tight squeeze. He turned back to her. His eyes locked onto her wrists. The silver had turned her skin a sickly gray. As the truth unraveled in his mind, he saw the extent of her suffering. Between them, something cracked. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a recognition of shared pain. He reached out and grabbed the chain, pulling her flush against his chest. The space between them burned. "Don't think this changes anything," he whispered. His breath was hot against her ear. "You are still the woman who broke my heart, and you are the man who won't listen to it," she countered. Her soul answered his heat with a desperate surge of its own. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. They weren't Alpha and Traitor. They were just two wolves dying in the cold. That night, the mountain became their world, and she let it happen because being his prisoner was better than being his memory. The air in the deeper tunnels was heavy with the smell of damp earth and ancient frost. Seraphina stumbled, her knees hitting the jagged ice, but the silver chains jerked her upward before she could crawl. Jax didn't look back, yet she felt the ripple of his muscles through the metal link. He was navigating by scent alone. After that, the tunnel opened into a wide, crystalline cavern where the walls glowed with a faint, blue bioluminescence. It was beautiful and deadly. Seraphina shivered because her white dress was now nothing more than a collection of wet rags. "We rest here," Jack stated. His voice echoed, flat and hard like the stone around them. He finally turned, his golden eyes scanning her from head to toe. What followed was a moment of stark realization for Seraphina. She saw the way his jaw tightened when he looked at her blue-tinged lips. She was dying of exposure, and his wolf knew it. In fact, his instinct to protect his mate was warring with his duty to punish a traitor. I can't feel my hands, Jax, she whispered. Her voice was thin. She held up her shackled wrists, where the silver had burned deep, angry welts into her skin. Still, he didn't reach for a key. Rather, he walked toward a small pool of steaming water at the edge of the cavern. The thermal vents, he muttered. The water is sulfurous, but it's warm. Next, he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the heat. He sat her down on the edge of the pool. He began to unwrap the chain from his own hand, but he didn't unlock the cuffs. Deep down, she knew the truth. He didn't trust her not to run, even in a blizzard. She watched him shed his torn shirt, revealing the massive, scarred landscape of his chest. Would you trust the man who chained you to save your life? The steam rose in thick clouds, blurring the edges of the cavern. Seraphina dipped her feet into the water, and the sudden heat felt like 1,000 needles. She hissed in pain. Soon after, Jax sat behind her, his large body acting as a windbreak against the drafts. The heat from his skin was more intoxicating than the water. Not only that, but the mate bond began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that demanded they touch. "Eat this," Jax said, handing her a piece of dried meat he'd kept in his belt. "I'm not hungry," she lied. Her stomach was cramped. "Eat," he growled. "I won't have you fainting when the shadow stalkers catch our scent." What's worse than the cold was the knowledge that scavengers lived in these depths. Seraphina took the meat. As the silence stretched, she felt his eyes on the back of her neck. She knew he was looking at the mark he'd given her months ago during their first hunt. It was a mark of ownership that now felt like a brand of shame. Maybe it was fate, but a low, clicking sound echoed from the dark tunnel they had just left. Jax stiffened. His ears flicked. "Shadow stalkers?" he whispered. "They've found the blood from your wrists." Truth be told, her injury was a dinner bell for the creatures of the deep. Jax stood up, his obsidian wolf shifting partially beneath his skin, his eyes glowing with the predatory light. Before she could move, he stepped in front of her, shielding her with his massive frame. Even so, the chains remained, a silver tether that meant if he fell, she went with him. The path ahead was a narrow ledge suspended over a bottomless crevasse. Seraphina pressed her back against the cold, damp stone, her breath coming in shallow hitches. Even though the silver was off her wrists, the ghost of its weight still lingered. Jax moved with the steady, rhythmic grace of a predator, his hand occasionally reaching back to ensure the chain, now just a loose tether, didn't snag on the rocks. After that, a low rumble shook the mountain again. This time, it wasn't a tremor. It was the sound of shifting ice. Seraphina stopped because the ground beneath her boots felt like it was dissolving. "Keep moving, Sarah," Jax commanded. He didn't turn around, but his voice was strained. "The ledge won't hold if you hesitate." What followed was a terrifying crack. The stone beneath Seraphina's left foot vanished. She plummeted, her scream cut short as the air was slapped out of her lungs. Still, she didn't hit the bottom. The silver chain snapped taut, jerking her shoulder nearly out of its socket. Jax had wrapped the end around his forearm and anchored himself to a solid outcrop. "I've got you!" he roared. Not only that, but he began to haul her up with a strength that defied the laws of nature. His muscles corded under his skin, and his golden eyes were blown wide with a desperate, raw terror. Deep down, she knew the truth. He wasn't just saving a prisoner. He was saving his mate. Eventually, he hauled her over the edge and pinned her against the wall. They were both gasping, their chests heaving in unison. "Don't ever do that again," Jax whispered. He was so close she could feel the heat of his anger and his relief. Rather than pulling away, he pressed his forehead against hers. The space between them burned with a hunger that the cold couldn't touch. Maybe it was fate, but in that moment of shared survival, the walls she had built around her secret began to crumble. How many times can you look death in the eye before you finally stop lying to the person beside you? The blizzard above had forced the cold deeper into the cave, and Seraphina began to shiver violently. Her wolf was too weak to shift, and the silver poisoning had left her delirious. Jax found a small alcove and pulled her into his lap, wrapping his massive obsidian cloak around them both. Soon after, the fever took hold. Seraphina's thoughts spun like a kaleidoscope of broken glass. In her haze, she grabbed Jax's collar. "The children," she muttered. Her voice was a broken rasp. "Jax, the children at the pass. They have your eyes." Jax stiffened. His body became a statue of ice. "What did you say?" he demanded. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. Truth be told, he thought she was mocking his trauma. "You stayed silent to protect the pack that slaughtered my kin, and now you lie about children?" "Not a lie," she whispered. "The pendant. Look in my pocket." Before she could move, Jax's large hands were digging into her torn dress. He pulled out the small, carved wooden wolf. It wasn't just a toy. It was a family crest. In fact, it was the exact match to the one he wore hidden beneath his leather harness. As the truth unraveled, the silence in the cave became a roar. Jax stared at the wood, his hands trembling. He realized that the enemy pups Seraphina saved were the descendants of the survivors he thought were dead. Between them, something cracked. Not just a bridge, but the entire foundation of his hate. In the span of a breath, Jax realized he had chained the woman who had saved his own bloodline. The agony on his face was worse than any silver burn. He let out a low, mournful howl that vibrated through the very marrow of Seraphina's bones. She felt it, etched in fire, the moment his heart broke and began to heal at the same time. Would you be able to forgive yourself if you found out your enemy was actually your greatest protector? The air in the alcove changed. The predatory tension was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating guilt. Jax didn't say a word. Instead, he pulled her closer, his touch no longer forceful, but agonizingly gentle. He began to rub her frozen limbs, his movements frantic. "Sarah, I didn't know," he choked out. His voice was thick with a grief he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Not only that, but he began to nuzzle the mark on her neck, his breath hot and pleading. "You didn't ask," she said. Her fever was breaking, but her heart was still heavy. "You chose the law over the bond, Jax. You chose to believe the worst of me. What's worse than the physical pain was the memory of the chains. Even so, she didn't push him away. She needed his heat to survive." Without warning, Jax reached down and grabbed the silver chain that still hung from her wrist. He didn't use the key this time. He shifted his hands into claws and snapped the links with a raw display of alpha power. I am a fool, Jax whispered. A blind, arrogant fool. He looked at the raw, gray skin where the silver had been. To make things worse, he saw the depth of the sacrifice she had made for a man who had called her a traitor. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. He wasn't her jailer anymore. He was her servant. He leaned down and kissed the scars on her wrists, his tears warm against her skin. I will tear the council apart for this, he vowed. His wolf was growling now, a deep, rhythmic sound of impending war. I will burn everything to the ground to keep you safe. Truth be told, the strategist in her knew the war was just beginning. But as the silence settled back into the cave, she finally let herself cry. She let it happen because for the first time in her life, she wasn't carrying the burden alone. The stakes were no longer just about survival. They were about a redemption that would be written in blood. Moments later, a distant sound echoed through the tunnels. The sharp, metallic clatter of armor and the barking of hounds. The council's exterminators had entered the frozen vein. They weren't just looking for a traitor. They were looking to finish the job and wipe out Jax's bloodline for good. Jax stood up, his obsidian wolf already surfacing beneath his skin. They're here, he said. His voice was a promise of death. Not only that, but he reached out and took Seraphina's hand, his fingers interlaced with hers. We can't fight them all in here, Seraphina said, her strategist's mind kicking back into gear. We need to lead them to the heart of the vein. The ice is thin there. As her wolf stirred, she felt a surge of strength she hadn't felt in days. The bond was pulsing now, a golden cord of energy connecting their souls. They were no longer prisoners and Alpha. They were a pack of two. Whatever happens, Jax said, his golden eyes locking onto hers. You are my law. You are my heart. And I will die before I let them touch you again. Without another word, they turned toward the sound of the hounds. The hunt was far from over, but this time the prey had found its teeth. As the sky darkened far above, Seraphina realized that the alibi of the heart was finally being spoken aloud. The game had changed, and the council had no idea what kind of monster they had just unleashed. The first shadow stalker lunged from the darkness, a pale, multi-limbed nightmare with eyes like black glass. Jax didn't shift fully because the tunnel was too narrow for his massive wolf form. Instead, he fought with a hybrid ferocity, his claws extended and his teeth bared. He moved like a blur of lethal grace. What followed was a symphony of snarls and the wet tearing of flesh. Seraphina watched, her pulse racing. She was a strategist, and she could see the creature's pattern. "Left, Jax! Hi!" she screamed. Her body moved on instinct, even with the chains. She swung the heavy length of the silver chain like a flail, catching a second stalker across its sensitive snout. The silver sizzled against the creature's hide. As a result, the beast shrieked and recoiled. Jax used the opening to rip the throat out of the first one. By the time the third one retreated into the shadows, the cave was painted in black, foul-smelling blood. Jax turned to her, his chest heaving. His face was splattered with gore. In the span of a breath, the anger in his eyes was replaced by a raw, naked wonder. She had helped him. She had fought by his side while wearing his shackles. "You saved my back," Jax muttered. He looked down at the silver chain in her hand, then at the blood on her fingers. Between them, something cracked. It wasn't a full repair of the bond, but it was a bridge. "I've always had your back, Jax," she said. Her voice was steady now. "That's what you never understood." She didn't know what scared her more, the monsters in the dark, or the fact that she still wanted him to hold her. Moments later, Jax reached out. He didn't grab the chain. Rather, he brushed a drop of blood from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was electric, a spark in the freezing dark. The adrenaline of the fight faded, leaving a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion. Serafina leaned against the cave wall, her eyes heavy. "We can't stay here," Jax said. "The scent of blood will bring more." Not only that, but the thermal pool was cooling as the vents shifted. He reached for the chains, but this time his movements were slower, almost hesitant. He looked at the raw skin beneath the silver. Without warning, he pulled a small iron key from a hidden pouch in his belt. The click of the lock was the loudest sound in the world. As the truth unraveled, she realized he was finally letting her go, partially. He removed the cuffs from her wrists, but kept the long chain looped around his own forearm. "You're free to move," he whispered. "But don't think for a second that I've forgiven you." Despite that, the relief of the silver leaving her skin was so intense she nearly collapsed. Her soul answered his mercy with a surge of warmth. "I don't need your forgiveness yet," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I just need you to survive long enough to see the truth." She stood up, her legs shaky but her spirit rising. As the sky darkened far above them, seen through a tiny fissure in the rock, didn't she realize the ordinary world was gone forever? The new reality was this: a man who hated her, a mountain that wanted to swallow them, and a bond that refused to break. That night, they moved deeper into the frozen vein, and she let it happen, because for the first time in her life, the strategist wasn't looking for an exit. She was looking for a way back to him. The baying of the hounds was a jagged blade cutting through the silence, but the weight of Jax's hand in mine was the only thing that kept me from shattering under the pressure of the hunt. The air in the tunnel turned sharp with the scent of wet fur and iron. Serafina squeezed Jax's hand, her strategist's mind already weaving through the narrow corridors like a spider. She knew every dead end and every hollow floor in this mountain. After that, she pulled him towards the eastern vent, a passage so tight even a pup would struggle to breathe. She moved because the exterminators were closing the distance with terrifying speed. Their hounds were bred for blood, and their handlers were the council's most ruthless killers. "If we go this way, we're trapped if they find the entrance," Jax whispered. He was crouched low, his obsidian wolf fur bristling against the low ceiling. Still, he didn't pull away. He followed her lead because he had finally realized that her mind was their greatest weapon. What followed was a claustrophobic crawl through the dark. The stone pressed against Serafina's back, cold and uncaring. In fact, she could hear the heavy thud of boots just a few yards above them. "Trust me," she breathed. Not only that, but she felt the shift in the air. The tunnel was opening into the glacial cathedral, a massive dome of ice that sat directly above the thermal core. Deep down, she knew the truth. They weren't just escaping. They were setting a trap that would change the pack forever. Soon after, They emerged into the blue-tinted light of the dome. The ground beneath them was a translucent sheet of ice, showing the boiling, volcanic water swirling meters below. Would you risk a 1,000-foot drop to take down an army? Jax stood at the center of the ice floor, his eyes scanning the 3 tunnels that led into the dome. "They'll be here in minutes," he said. His voice was a low, resonant growl. He turned to Seraphina, and for the first time, he didn't see a strategist or a traitor. He saw his mate. Maybe it was fate, but he reached out and cupped her face, his thumb tracing the faint scar on her jaw. "I should have known," he whispered. "The moment the chains touched you, I should have known you were too pure for this world." "The world isn't pure, Jax," she replied. Her voice didn't tremble. Rather, she leaned into his touch, savoring the heat. "It's messy and cruel, but it's ours." Truth be told, she wanted to stay in this moment forever. Instead, she pointed to the cracks she had identified in the ice. "When they enter, we need to draw them to the center. The thermal pressure is at its peak. One well-placed strike will drop the floor." Before she could move, the first hound burst into the cathedral. It was a massive, scarred beast with glowing red eyes. Behind it stepped Elder Varric's lead executioner. Even so, the man stopped when he saw Jax. He didn't expect the Alpha to be standing side by side with the prisoner. "Alpha Jax!" the man called out, his voice echoing. "Step away from the traitor. The council has ordered her immediate termination." As the silence roared, Jax stepped forward. He didn't move toward the exit. He moved toward the center of the ice, pulling Seraphina with him. The tension in the dome was a physical weight. More guards filtered in, their silver-tipped spears glinting in the bioluminescence. "She isn't the traitor!" Jax roared. His voice was so powerful it caused a light dusting of frost to fall from the ceiling. "The council lied to you. They lied to me. They tried to murder my bloodline to keep their seats." What's worse, the guards didn't lower their weapons. They were loyal to the gold in Varric's pockets, not the blood in the Alpha's veins. "Kill them both!" the lead executioner commanded. Without warning, the hounds lunged. In the span of a breath, the cathedral was a whirlwind of fur and steel. Jax shifted fully this time. His obsidian wolf was a mountain of muscle and rage. He tore through the hounds, his teeth snapping bone like dry twigs. At the same time, Seraphina moved like a ghost. She used her silver chains, the ones Jax had broken, as a whip. She lashed out at the guards, her movements precise and lethal. Between them, something cracked. It was the sound of the ice. To make things worse, the heat from the thermal vents was rising, turning the floor into a death trap. Seraphina saw the cracks spreading toward Jax. "Now, Jax, jump!" she screamed. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. Jax lunged for the ledge, saw grabbing Seraphina in midair just as the center of the cathedral floor disintegrated. A pillar of scalding steam exploded upward, swallowing the executioners and their hounds in a roar of white heat. Moments later, the only sound left was the hiss of the steam and the pounding of their hearts. They were huddled on a narrow stone shelf, the cathedral behind them now, a gaping maw of fire and ice. Seraphina looked at Jax. He was back in human form, his skin covered in soot, but his eyes were glowing with a new light. "We can't go back now," he said. His voice was steady. "By the time morning comes, The whole pack will know I chose you over them." "Then we make them understand why," she said. She felt it, etched in fire. The path of no return was behind them. Not only that, but the bond between them was no longer a tether. It was an anchor. They had committed to a war they couldn't win alone. Truth be told, the strategist in her was already planning the next move. They needed to find the children. They needed to find the survivors. "We go to the sanctuary," Jax vowed. He stood up and offered his hand. No chains, no shackles. Just the open palm of a man who would follow her into the mouth of hell. She took his hand and let it happen, because the alibi of the heart was no longer a secret. It was a battle cry. As the sky darkened far above, they turned their backs on the only home they had ever known, heading deeper into the storm to find the future she had risked everything to save. The valley below the frozen vein should have been a haven, but it looked like a graveyard of ash and splintered pine, and Seraphina's legs gave out as they reached the perimeter of the rogue's sanctuary. After that, she saw the flags of the Ironclaw High Council fluttering in the bitter wind. They were too late. The exterminators hadn't just followed them. They had anticipated them. Seraphina moved because she saw a small, familiar wooden toy lying in the blood-stained snow. It was the wooden wolf she had given the children. "No," she whispered. Her voice was a hollow gust of wind. Jax was beside her, his body rigid, his obsidian wolf practically clawing to get out. Still, he stayed silent. What followed was a cold, calculated ambush. From the shadows of the burnt cabins, 20 elite guards stepped out. They weren't holding spears. They were holding heavy silver net launchers. In fact, Elder Varric himself walked out from behind the lead guard. He looked smug. He looked like a man who had already won. "You led us right to them, strategist," Varric sneered. "We didn't even have to track the brats. We just waited for you to show us the way." Deep down, she knew the truth. Her brilliance had been her undoing. Every move she made to save them had left a trail for the monsters to follow. Not only that, but Varric signaled the guards. Soon after, the silver nets were in the air. Before she could move, the weighted mesh slammed into her, the silver burning her skin like 1,000 hornet stings. Would you be able to keep fighting when your own mind becomes the enemy? The agony of the silver net was so intense that Seraphina's vision turned into a blur of gray and white. She was pinned to the frozen ground, her wolf whimpering in the deepest corners of her soul. Next, she heard the sound of a struggle. Jax was fighting like a demon, but he was one wolf against a legion. They weren't trying to kill him. They were exhausting him. What's worse, Varric pulled a small, shivering figure from a nearby shed. It was the oldest girl Seraphina had saved. "Stop!" Seraphina screamed, her throat raw from the smoke. "Jax, stop! They have them!" In the span of a breath, Jax froze. His obsidian fur was matted with blood. He looked at Seraphina under the net, then at the child in Varric's grip. Maybe it was fate, but the defiance in his eyes died out, replaced by a devastating, quiet resignation. Rather than fighting, he shifted back into his human form. He stood naked and bleeding in the snow, his head bowed. "Take me," Jax said. His voice was a dead thing. "Let her go. Let the children go. I am the one who abandoned the law." Truth be told, the sacrifice didn't move Varric. Instead, The elder laughed. He signaled a guard, who slammed the butt of a spear into Jax's temple. Seraphina watched as the man she loved crumpled into the red-stained snow. In that moment, her world tilted. Everything she had fought for, the children, the redemption, the mate bond, was being erased by the very hands she had tried to protect. The council guards dragged Seraphina toward a heavy iron cage, the silver net still searing her flesh. She was thrown inside, the bars smelling of old blood and rusted dreams. To make things worse, they threw Jax's unconscious body into the cage next to her, separated only by a wall of silver-dipped iron. As the silence roared, Seraphina reached through the bars, her fingers barely brushing his cold skin. "Jax," she sobbed, "I'm so sorry. I should have been faster. I should have known." "You did exactly what I expected," Varric said, standing outside her cage. He held the wooden wolf token and crushed it under his boot. "You cared, and caring is the ultimate traitor to the pack." Not only that, but he leaned in close, his breath smelling of sour wine. "In the morning, the pack will watch as the traitor strategist and the fallen Alpha are executed. And the children? They go to the laboratories. We need to know why their blood is so special." Between them, something cracked. Not the bond, but Seraphina's spirit. She collapsed on the floor of the cage, her forehead pressed against the freezing metal. Her internal flaw, the belief that she had to carry the world's morality alone, had finally crushed her. Even so, there was no plan. There was no tactical exit. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted from a story of hope to a tragedy of errors. Truth be told, the strategist was gone. Only a broken woman remained. Moments later, the camp grew quiet as the guards settled in for the night. The only sound was the crackle of the fires and the distant mournful howl of a lone wolf in the mountains. Seraphina looked at Jax, who was still out cold. His breathing was shallow. She felt it, etched in fire, the lowest point of her life. She had failed him. She had failed her bloodline. As the sky darkened far above, she realized that the alibi of the heart was a lie. Love hadn't saved them. It had only given their enemies a target. Without warning, the youngest child, hidden in a pile of furs in the corner of a nearby wagon, caught Seraphina's eye. The girl didn't look scared. She looked expectant. She was waiting for the strategist to do something. But for the first time in her life, Seraphina had nothing. "How could I have been so blind?" she whispered to the shadows. As her wolf stirred one last time, it wasn't a growl of anger, but a whimper of defeat. That night, the frost began to claim the sanctuary, and she let it happen, because the dark was the only thing left that didn't demand her to be a hero. Frost on the iron bars was thick, but the heat from Jax's hand, finally twitching against hers, was the only thing that mattered. Seraphina watched him groan as he blinked his eyes open in the moonlight. After that, he looked at the silver bars and then at the raw burns on her arms. He didn't speak because his grief was too heavy for words. Still, a tiny tapping sound pulled Seraphina's attention away from their shared misery. Next, she saw the youngest child, the little girl with Jax's golden eyes, crawling silently beneath the shadow of the wagon toward their cage. "The key," the girl whispered. Her voice was as thin as a reed. She held up a ring of iron keys she had swiped from a sleeping guard's belt. What followed was a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline in Seraphina's chest. Her strategist's mind which had been dormant in her despair, began to fire with 1,000 calculations. In fact, she realized that the council's arrogance was their true weakness. They thought the children were just prey. Not only that, but they thought a broken strategist was no longer a threat. "Sarah," Jax whispered. His voice was gaining strength. He watched the girl slide the key into the lock. Deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't just a rescue. This was a chance to end the cycle of blood once and for all. Soon after, the lock clicked open. Before she could move, Serafina grabbed the child's hand. "Tell the others to be ready," she commanded. "When the moon hits the peak, we don't run. We fight." Would you find the courage to plan a revolution from inside a cage? The silence of the camp was a lie that Serafina used to her advantage. She and Jax moved through the shadows like twin ghosts, their feet silent on the bloody snow. Rather than fleeing into the woods, they circled back toward the council's main tent. Jax looked at her, his head tilted. "We're going for Varric?" he asked. His voice was a low, hungry growl. Truth be told, his wolf wanted to tear the man apart, but he waited for her plan. "Not just Varric," she replied. She pointed to the signal pyres surrounding the camp. "We need to light those. If the rest of the pack sees the traitor signal coming from Varric's own tent, they'll realize who the real enemy is." Maybe it was fate, but a guard turned the corner just as she spoke. Before he could scream, Jax was on him. His movements were a blur of obsidian power. What's worse, the guard's spear clattered against the stone, ringing out like a bell. Moments later, the camp erupted into chaos. Serafina didn't panic because she had already mapped the exits. Not only that, but she saw the other children emerging from the shadows, armed with the silver net launchers they had stolen back. "Now, Jax, the pyre!" she screamed. In the span of a breath, the first signal fire roared to life, casting a blood-red light over the valley. Between them, something cracked, not the bond, but the council's control over the soldiers. The elite guards were confused. They looked at the signal fires and then at the Alpha standing tall amidst the flames. "Varric is the traitor," Jax's voice echoed like thunder through the valley. "He stole your bloodline. He lied to your faces." To make things worse, Varric emerged from his tent, his face twisted in a mask of panic. He realized the game was changing. Even so, he grabbed a silver-tipped crossbow and aimed it directly at Serafina. "Kill them!" Varric shrieked. "They are manipulating you!" Without warning, the children fired the silver nets. Instead of hitting Serafina, the weighted mesh landed directly on Varric's guards. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The hunters were now the hunted. Serafina moved with a focused energy. She didn't have her chains, but she had her mind. She led the counterstrike with a precision that turned the guards against their own masters. As the truth unraveled, the soldiers began to lower their weapons. They saw the children. They saw the wooden wolf tokens. Because of that, they saw the face of the family they had been told was dead. Jax moved toward Varric, his obsidian wolf fur gleaming in the firelight. "The ceremony is back on, Varric," Jax growled. "But this time, the chains are for you." Truth be told, the final push was no longer a desperate escape. It was a reclaiming of their throne. The air in the sanctuary was thick with the scent of victory and smoke. Serafina stood by Jax's side. her hand resting on his powerful shoulder. They were surrounded by the pack, by the children, and by the soldiers who had finally chosen a side. "Is it over?" Jax asked, his golden eyes searching hers. Not only that, but he looked at the ruins of the camp and the bound council members. "No," Seraphina said. Her strategist's mind was already looking at the horizon. "This was just the first battle. We have to rebuild. We have to show them a pack built on mercy, not iron." Still, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since before the chains. She felt it, etched in fire. The bond was finally free. What followed was a quiet moment of connection amidst the ruins. "Whatever comes next," Jax whispered, pulling her into his heat. "We face it as one. No more secrets, no more silence." She took his hand and let it happen because the alibi of the heart had become a promise. As the sky darkened far above, the final push ended, not with a whimper of defeat, but with a roar that shook the very foundations of the mountain. They were no longer running from the dark. They were the light that was going to burn it away. The final confrontation didn't happen with an army. It happened in the silence of the high mountain pass, where the sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon. Elder Varric stood at the edge of the cliff, his eyes wild, clutching the stolen scrolls of the ancient bloodline. Seraphina stood 10 paces away, her silver wolf fur bristling, but she stayed in her human form to show her true strength. After that, Jax stepped forward, his presence so massive it seemed to still the wind. He didn't growl because his silence was more terrifying than any sound. "It's over, Varric," Seraphina said. Her voice was steady, the voice of a strategist who had already won the board. Next, she gestured to the pack members standing behind her. Soldiers, mothers, and the children she had saved. They were no longer divided by fear. Varric laughed, a high, brittle sound. "You think mercy can rule? You think these pups make a pack?" He lunged, not at Jax, but at the ledge, intending to take the secrets of the bloodline to his grave. What followed was a blur of instinct. Before either could speak, Seraphina moved. She didn't use a weapon. She used the environment she had studied so well. She kicked a loose sheet of ice into Varric's path. He slipped, his grip on the scrolls loosening. In the span of a breath, Jax leaped. He didn't kill Varric. He caught the scrolls in his teeth and pinned the elder to the stone with a single, massive paw. Between them, something cracked, the last remnant of the old, cruel order. The central question was answered. Mercy was not a weakness. It was the ultimate tactical advantage. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of relief and exhausting joy. Jax stood over the scrolls, shifting back into a man whose face was finally free of the cold logic that had haunted him. Seraphina walked to him, her legs shaking from the adrenaline. Soon after, the guards she had outmaneuvered stepped forward, but they didn't raise their spears. They knelt. They were tending to wounds and reuniting families. Not only that, but the youngest girl ran to Seraphina, burying her face in the white, torn silk of her dress. "We're safe?" the girl asked. Her voice was full of wonder. "You're home," Seraphina replied. Her heart ached with a mix of grief for what was lost and hope for what was found. Still, she looked at Jax. He was watching her with a raw, naked adoration. He didn't care about the scrolls or the power. Rather, he walked to her and lifted her into his arms. The scent of him, pine, rain, and now overwhelming peace filled her lungs. Moments later, the sun fully cleared the peaks, bathing the valley in gold. The conflict was resolved, and the transformation of the silver shadow was complete. 3 months later, the Ironclaw pack didn't look like a fortress. It looked like a community. The great hall was filled with the sound of laughter and the smell of roasting meat. Seraphina sat at the head of the table, a new set of silver jewelry around her neck, crafted not as chains, but as delicate, interlocking leaves. Jax sat beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back. Because of that touch, she felt grounded in a way she never had before. Truth be told, the alibi of the heart had become the pack's new constitution. "The northern pass is clear," she said, her strategist's mind still sharp but focused on trade and travel now. Jax smiled, a real warm smile that reached his eyes. Not only that, but he leaned in and kissed her temple. "Let the scouts rest today, Sarah," he murmured. "Today is for us." Maybe it was fate, but the children she saved were playing in the courtyard, their golden eyes reflecting the peace they had earned. The bond between Seraphina and Jax was no longer a secret or a struggle. It was the heartbeat of the mountain. As the silence roared with contentment, Seraphina looked out at her pack. She felt it, etched in fire, the belonging she had always craved. No more secrets, no more silence, just a future built on the truth of their love. That's why she didn't fear the shadows anymore. She let it happen because she was no longer just a strategist for an alpha. She was the queen of a new era. What followed was a life where the only chains were the ones they broke together. The moon was full, hanging like a silver coin over the frozen vein. Seraphina and Jax stood at the thermal pool where the chains had been cast away. "Looking back," Seraphina whispered into the night air, "I should have known that the chains didn't break me. They were just the iron needed to forge a new heart." Jax pulled her close, his obsidian wolf spirit humming against hers. "What would you have done in my place?" he asked softly, with a playful glint in his eyes. "Exactly what I did," she laughed, leaning into his heat. "I would have saved you from yourself." They shifted together, two sleek, powerful wolves running into the trees. In the quiet that followed, the only sound was the wind carrying their names. The story was over, but their legend was just beginning. Love hadn't just saved them, it had redefined the world, and as the forest held its breath, the two wolves disappeared into the starlight, finally, truly free.